What's up, Restoration? Brian here. So thankful that you're here with us again for another week of Bible stories. We are in week 3, and we're going over some of these stories that we may have heard as kids. Maybe you learned it in a Sunday school that had something like this with a felt board on it, and you had characters like that where you didn't really know. One week they were Moses, the next week they were Jonah. That didn't happen to us yet. But those are the two stories that we went over, Moses parting the Red Sea and then Jonah and the whale. And we're trying to go through these stories that we learned as kids or as young adults, whatever that was, mostly kids probably, or we heard from someone who had heard the story, and trying to glean new information, new ideas that we can learn from and grow from, and things that we can apply to our lives. And so we are in the series. And this week, I was studying the story that we're on, and I was reminded of the scientific fact that everything moves towards chaos, right? Everything in our lives moves towards chaos. The entire universe, everything moves towards chaos. If I don't upkeep my room, it goes to chaos. If your kids don't keep their rooms clean, it goes to chaos. Grass grows and it becomes chaos, and schools get let out early, and chaos ensues trying to teach children when you're not a teacher. I think that's about the most chaotic thing. Even in relationships, if we don't tend to our relationships, if we don't cultivate and develop the relationships, especially within our own marriages, you see that chaos and deterioration is the next thing that happens. And it's really important. And in fact, in this season that we're in, I find myself learning more about myself and learning more about my wife than I thought I ever would have. And we've been married for almost 15 years now, and that's a long time for me. It just seems that's a lot. And those of you who have been married for much longer, that's nothing. But anyway, I've been married to her for 15 years, and I'm just now realizing, and in fact, a few weeks ago, I finally figured out what my wife's love language was, and it was it's that she loves to have conversations and to talk. The quality time one, I think, is what it's called, and not just like watching movies and that kind of a thing, but just having conversation, and not even just about not deep things, just having conversation. And so I learned those things, and I tried doing some of that for her, and it was something I realized when she brought it up to me, that I was not doing that great of a job, and that was true. I am more of a selfish person personally. I tend to only think of myself and the things that I need and the things that I want, and so when I make purchases, any of that, it's usually geared towards the things that I want and the things that I need. Even when I am giving a gift to my wife, it turns out that way. In fact, this happened. In fact, what brought this whole conversation up was because of a gift that I had just given her. It was in a box from Amazon, and it was dinner time, and I gave her the box. She opened it thinking maybe there would be a candle in there, maybe some candles, and I just said that, some flowers perhaps, or some seeds, something to grow in the garden, that kind of a thing. But no, I did something much different. She pulled a thing out of the box, and it was Chick-fil-A sauce. That's right, my friends. I gifted my wife Chick-fil-A sauce, and it went over about as well as you could imagine that would go over, which is not that great. Relationships are hard, and they need cultivation. And that evening, I needed to do a lot of cultivating in that relationship, because see, she likes Chick-fil-A just as much as the next person does, and I love Chick-fil-A, and so does my wife, or so do my children. And so I thought, this would be a gift for her, but it would also be a gift for me. And guys, I just got to tell you, don't get a gift for your wife that's also a gift for you, if you know what I mean. You know what I mean? I'm not talking about Chick-fil-A sauce anymore. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so chaos. It is all around us, and some of us feel it more now than we ever have before. And the things that are good, if we don't continue to cultivate the things that are good, they deteriorate as well. It's like having a nicely manicured lawn. If we just don't keep cultivating it, the lawn is going to turn nasty. And I only know that because I just mowed my lawn for the first time this year, and it's the same as it was last year, very bumpy and hard to mow because I can't go very fast because of all the bumps. And I haven't cultivated that yard yet, and so it's just gone to chaos. And even when things are good, like I said, it brings us to chaos. And the story we find ourselves in for this week is a similar situation to chaos. It was people who had it good, got comfortable, and it turned bad. Backstory is we're going to be in 1 Kings today. We're going to be in chapter 18 specifically, but there's a lot of backstory that I need to fill in beforehand. So this was after good old Mo parted the Red Sea and they walked through and all that kind of stuff. Israel has established itself as a nation, and in the first part of 1 Kings, it details the death of David. He finally dies. He was the king of Israel, and he was a great king. It says that he was a man after God's own heart, and He had his bad moments, and we could talk about those. In fact, we're going to be talking about David in the next couple of weeks. We've got a special guest who's going to be talking about David that I'm not going to reveal yet. So there. So we have David. He was king, and then he passed the throne on to his son Solomon. Now, Solomon was a guy who was incredibly wise because God asked him what he wanted. Solomon asked for wisdom, and God gave him boatloads of wisdom. So he was the wisest man around. People would come from all over the world to come and ask Solomon questions. And this was the guy ruling after David. And he was a very rich man. God blessed him with abundant riches. And so he had all the money he could ever want. He had all the wisdom he ever needed. And he was a great king for the first part. In fact, he built the temple, this giant temple. In fact, it took like 3 chapters in 1 Kings just to talk about the temple and how large this thing was. So he's doing all of these things, but as it so happens, good things, when we focus too much on the good things, except for who the giver of the good things are, it becomes a bad thing, right? And so we have this guy Solomon, King Solomon, and towards the end of his life, or maybe the middle of his life, he decides that he's going to look away from God and look towards women. Not just one woman, not just 2 women, not 3 women, no, 700. He had 700 wives. Most of them were foreign wives, and that was something that was not an okay thing at that time. It doesn't say anything about today. That's just for that time. It wasn't an okay thing. Plus, he had 300 concubines. The 700 wives wasn't enough. He also needed 300 more on the side. That's a lot. And so he went away from God. He turned his back on God, the God who had given him wisdom, the God who had given him wealth, the God who had given him so much things. And Solomon even returned the favor in building this giant temple. He turned away from God. It can happen to anyone. And he leads Israel into this bad time. In fact, there's a bunch of kings that follow afterwards, and there's a split in the kingdom. We have Israel, and then we have Judah. We've got 2 separate kingdoms. It was a civil war that went on, and they split, and we have Israel, and then we have Judah, and that's where we find ourselves in this story today. We have a guy named Ahab, and he's ruling Israel, and he doesn't rule it very well. In fact, he has a wife, and her name is Jezebel. And she was the daughter of a king of a Sidonian, which doesn't really matter to you. And he began to bow down and worship the idol Baal. Jezebel turned him away. Jezebel was a bad person. Jezebel was the type of person that your mama warned you about. You know what I'm saying? This was the person that mama warned you about, Jezebel. Don't go near the Jezebels. Ahab did, and he turned Israel even further away from God. In fact, he turned completely away from God and started worshiping Baal. And Baal was a false god. And there were all these prophets of Baal. There were 450 at this time, prophets of Baal. And there was one prophet of God, and his name was Elijah. Now, I don't know about you, I would always get confused between Elijah and Elisha, and for good reason. Elijah appointed Elisha to be his successor. And I don't know why he didn't appoint somebody named like Jim. So there was Elijah and then there was Jim. That would have made a lot more sense to me because I get it confused. I get Elijah and Elisha confused to this day. I'm not sure which one was. I was like, which one got taken away on a chariot? It was Elijah. I looked it up. It was not Elisha. But I get those two confused. It would be like if the successor to Donald Trump, the next election, was a guy named Ronald Frump, right? That would be the similar thing. I hope Ronald Frump runs for office because I think that would be awesome. Ronald, if you're out there, go for it, my man. Okay, we're in 1 Kings chapter 18. We've kind of set the story up. Ahab is king. He's not doing a great job because he's following Baal, and Jezebel, his wife, is also following Baal and gets everyone to kind of, in Israel, to follow Baal. So Elijah comes up to Israel and he makes a proclamation. He's gonna say he's gonna have this contest basically between his God, the God of Israel, the one true God, and Baal, and they're gonna see which one wins out. And so he decides to have this this contest on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal and himself. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves. That's where we're going to pick this story up in 1 Kings chapter 18, starting in verse 20. It says, "So Ahab summoned all the people of Israel and the prophets to Mount Carmel. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left." I said that weird. "But Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God." And all the people agreed. So basically we have this guy named Elijah. Here's Elijah. He doesn't actually probably have a mullet. I gave him a mullet because it's later in the story. It'll make sense. But I gave him a mullet because he seemed like a guy who would have a mullet, you know. And then we've got the prophets of Baal, 450 of them. Look at, whoa, I almost lost the whole thing. Oh my goodness, that would have been a terrible, terrible tragedy. So we've got the prophets of Baal. They're a whole bunch of goobers. You got this guy with his arm over on another guy. What's that all about? We've got this guy stroking his beard. He's not sure what he's doing. It's a big mess. And there's 450 of these schmucks, and they have to build a temple, or not a temple. They have to build an altar. And whoever wins this contest is who the true God is. And so they lay down the ground rules. I don't know if you've ever been in a fight before. I have not. I don't know if you can tell that or not, but I have never been in a fight. I've seen one fight actually in person, but there were no ground rules beforehand. But in my mind, you've got the ground rules, right? No punches to the face, the moneymaker, no punches below the belt, keep it clean, no sucker punches, dinner's on at 5:30, whatever that is. Okay, so we've got the ground rules laid for this battle, for this contest to see who the true God is. And there's 450 prophets of Baal, and there's one prophet of God. The odds are not in his favor, it would seem, right? That's what it seems like. Okay, let's keep going. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "You go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it, and call on the name of your God, but do not set fire to the wood." So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. "You'll have to shout louder," he scoffed, "for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming, or he is relieving himself." That's in the Bible right there. Or maybe he is away on a trip, or is asleep and needs to be wakened. So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of evening sacrifice, but still there was no sound, no reply, and no response. So they got this altar, right? These guys, the prophets of Baal, decided to build this altar, and they put their wood on it. Oh, and by the way, during this time, there's a dry spell. There's a drought happening. So real dry wood Sorry about your face there, Elijah. And they put the bowls on there, and nothing happens. And then Elijah, this is why he's got a mullet, because he starts taunting them. He's like Joe Dirt taunting them, and he's telling them, "Hey, if you can't, maybe your God's asleep." He's taunting their God, which probably to them was not very cool, not very sportsmanlike. But he's got confidence, which is kind of weird, because later on in the story, we're not going to get to it, he does not have any confidence. None whatsoever. So he's taunting the prophets of Baal. There's 450 of them, and there's one of him, and he's taunting all 450 of them with no regard for what's going to happen next. He does not care, because he knows what's going to happen next. So what does happen next? Glad you asked. Then Elijah called to the people, "Come over here." He called them all over. So theirs didn't work very well. And they all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around the altar, large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled the wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. So he's got this. I don't have a way to build the trench, and he puts this guy on here. And he's got a trench around there. Then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour the water over the offering and the wood." After they had done this, he said, "Do the same thing again." And then when they were finished, he said, "Now do it a 3rd time." So he's got 4 large jars of water, does it 3 times, that's 12. That's pretty well wet. And if I know anything about building fires, I don't, but if I know anything about building fires, you need dry wood in order for it to light, right? You can't use wet wood. Just don't work. I'm a man of the mountains. I'm a man of the woods. I know that kind of stuff. Elijah knows that stuff. He's got a mullet. So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed. This is what he does, completely different than the prophets of Baal. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God and that you have brought them back to yourself." So all Elijah does, he makes it even more difficult. The 450 prophets, they tried to do it as easily as they possibly could. Elijah goes and makes it even more difficult, puts water on everything, makes everything incredibly wet, so there's almost no chance that this lights on anything but a miracle. And then the only thing that he does is he prays. He prays his heart out to God. He doesn't cut himself. He doesn't do all of this stuff. See, this is the difference between other religions and Christianity, is that we have to do nothing except just pray to him, to follow him. That's the only thing that we're required to do, if we choose to do it. And the problem is we find ourselves spending so much time trying to do things on our own that we forget to trust in the one true God. What happens next? Immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out. So fire comes on to the bowl. Those guys are in trouble. The Lord, he is God. Yes, the Lord is God. Then Elijah commanded, "Seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape." So the people seized them all, and Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley and killed them there. That's an odd twist to the story, is it not? He killed them all. So God lights the whole thing on fire, proves that he is the one true God. The people repent and turn towards him, and they round up all the prophets, and they kill him. Now, all of them. Now, why did they have to do that? Why did they have to kill all of the prophets, all 450 prophets? Why was that the thing that Elijah made them do? Because God is ruthless with sin. See, these prophets of Baal, these people of Baal, they were turning Israel away from the one true God. They were taking their focus off of the one true God and putting it on something that did not matter, something that did not measure up, something that would not provide them what they needed. And to try to keep them holy, God, in this entire Old Testament, is God trying to bring the people of Israel back to Him by any means necessary. He's so protective of Israel that He's going to do anything He has to do to protect His children in Israel. So the Old Testament God is the same, hear me, as the New Testament God. It just looks a little bit different because now we have the free will to do this. We need to be ruthless with sin. God is ruthless with sin, so we are ruthless with sin. His wrath remains the same on those who do not confess and do not follow. His wrath was the same on His own Son, Jesus Christ, who had to pay the penalty for our sin. God is ruthless with sin. We just have somebody who took our place. And if we're not this ruthless with sin, if we don't cut it out of our lives, if we don't destroy it, if we don't kill the sin in our lives, it's going to kill us. See, I don't like reading that. I don't like reading verse 40. I wanted to try to find a way to stop at 39. But God is ruthless with sin, and we're going to find out why in a little bit. But the next thing I want to talk about is this. There's a prayer that happens that Elijah gives, mullet Elijah. And made me think of this, that God proves Himself to His people for His people. The people needed a sign that He was the one true God. See, they had been led so far astray that they needed to see something that was going to turn them back towards God. So God proves Himself to His people for His people. It says that Elijah said in verse 36, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me. Answer me. Why? So these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself." The reason God proves Himself to His people is for His people, so that they will turn back, so that you and I will turn back. And He's going to meet us exactly where we are. That's the cool thing about God, is He meets us exactly where we are. I've been involved in men's ministry for a while, and there's this one guy in particular who's a friend of mine now, and when he first showed up, he didn't know a single thing about God. He was kind of forced to come to this thing because of things that were going on in his life. And he didn't know much about God, hardly anything at all. And we were going through the Gospel of Mark, and I remember at one point in this whole discussion that he kept coming week after week, and he couldn't wait to get to Easter to figure out how the story ends. He knew Easter was important, but he didn't know how we got to Easter. And anyway, this was a friend of mine who liked to see signs of things, who looked at horoscopes, and he did all that kind of stuff. He loved looking at the stars and the symbols and all this kind of stuff, and what it meant for his life. And the day that he got saved, the day that he decided to completely follow Jesus, he had pulled into his garage after work that day. He works in construction, and so he pulls into the garage, and there's a table and some chair pieces in his way. So he had to move them out of the way in order for him to pull into the garage. So he moved this stuff out of the way. That's a picture of the stuff that he had moved to prove that I'm not lying. And so he moves all this stuff out of the way. He goes inside. That night he went out for a smoke, and he looks up in the clouds. It was an evening thing. Looks up in the clouds, and he saw something that completely blew his mind. And I don't remember exactly what it was. He told me, but I don't remember. But I do know the rest of the story. The next morning, he gets out, and he's going to work. And the wood was in the way of him getting out of the garage. Now, he had moved the wood so he could get into the garage. And now here's the wood again in his way from getting out of the garage. So he had to move this stack of wood, all of this wood that he had already moved once to get into the garage. Now he has to move it again to get out of the garage. It doesn't make any sense. And as he's moving the wood, this is a guy who doesn't believe Jesus yet. He doesn't believe all the words of Jesus yet. He doesn't believe fully that God is who he says he is. And as he moves all of this stuff out of the way, he's clearing stuff out, he sees this. And he called me that morning to figure out what he had to do to follow Jesus. God proves himself to his people for his people. Even in the New Testament, we see Thomas, right? One of the disciples, he doubted that Jesus was who he said he is after the resurrection. And so Jesus had to show him the scars, the holes in his hands and in his feet and in his side to prove that he was Jesus. God proves himself to his people for his people. Problem is, we don't pay attention. Worship is just paying attention to God. We think of worship as this experience that we get to have every single weekend. Well, used to have every single weekend where we come together and we sing together. That was the worship part. Then we had the speaking part and all that other kind of stuff and the offering and all these different things. But we've whittled worship down to just the singing of songs. And worship is so much bigger than that. Worship is just simply paying attention to God. And if we're paying attention to God, God is going to prove himself to his people for his people, if we're looking for it. The other thing that I see here in this passage of Scripture is in verse 21, where Elijah stands in front of all of Israel and he says, "How much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." Elijah's saying, whatever's going on, you need to pick one. You need to follow one. Whoever you think is God, follow it. No more of this wavering. No more going back and forth, because God requires total commitment. God requires total commitment. And this can look different for a whole lot of different people for and how that goes and how we are able to commit is a very interesting thing. I find myself I have a hard time with total commitment. We've I'm sure talked about this before, but I have a hard time with total commitment because I know what it's going to require me to do. And that's a step that I'm still wrestling with. I'll take little steps, and the beautiful thing is God continues to meet me exactly where I'm at. He continues to prove himself that he is trustworthy, that he is good, that he has the best interest in heart, that all of these things are going to work together for his good, for those who seek him, not for my good, ultimately for my good, but more so for his good and his glory. And so I take these small, tiny little steps towards God. And he rewards every single step I take. And I know there's going to come a moment where I am on the high dive right at the pool, and I'm inching closer and closer and closer. And there's a moment where I am going to jump off, and it's exhilarating. It's awesome. I've done it before. I've gone cliff jumping before out in West Virginia. I've jumped off of 15, 20-foot cliffs and into the water. And there's this moment where you release and you let go, and there's no turning back because you're in the air. And it's scary for a moment. And then you hit the water and it's awesome, and you do it again and again and again. But sometimes it takes a moment to have that total commitment. And this isn't just like a one-time thing where I totally committed to Jesus back when I asked him into my heart. That's like saying, hey, I committed to my wife back when we got married, and so I don't need to commit anymore. We need to commit every single day. Every single morning we wake up, and we need to make a decision to totally commit to him. And sometimes for me, it looks different than other days. Some days I'm tipping out towards that the water, and sometimes I'm running right in. It reminded me of a show that I used to watch. And there's a clip on here of what I feel like I look like to God when I'm trying to totally commit. And it's a little bit silly, but I wanted to show this to you guys. That's me. That's me totally committing to God. And sometimes I need a little bit of help. I'll look down off the ledge and be ready to get back on. It's scary to let somebody else be in the driver's seat. It's scary to let that total commitment happen, to not be in any sort of control. But it's the thing that we need to do. So what does it look like? What does total commitment look like? Well, it looks like this. It's committing to getting closer to God. It's this idea of every day continuing to get closer to the God that loves us. It's spending time in this book, finding out more about who God is and what He has done for us. It's this thing. There's a what's the word when you have a bunch of letters all in a row that then there's each one acronym. That's what it is. Aspire. A friend of mine gave this to me. She's a chairman of our board. She gave this word to me, aspire, and she lives by this. It means that she abides spiritually, personally, intellectually, relationally, and emotionally. She has this check and balances of her own self and making sure that she is abiding in all of those areas with God, with Jesus. And that's how we commit to getting closer. We keep an inventory of how we're doing spiritually, personally, intellectually, relationally, and emotionally. Are we connecting in all of those ways with God? We commit to getting closer. See, people who are in like an addiction program, they need to commit a total commitment to no longer doing the thing that's causing them to stumble, whether it's a sexual addiction, whether it's an alcohol addiction, or any other type of addiction. There's this turning away from and turning towards something and totally committing. And the people who totally commit, the ones who dive all in, head first, into that deep, deep water, are the ones who see their lives completely changed. They commit to God's truth about Himself and about us. And they commit to selflessness. And it's those people who will totally commit to God that are aspiring. Let's see this happen. God's power continues in total commitment. See, our lives are filled with chaos. Everything around us is just chaos. Don't you feel that? I feel chaos more often than not. In my life around, even outside of a stay at home, I see chaos. And when I choose anything other than Jesus, I see chaos. If I choose anything other than the Word, I see chaos. If I choose anything other than living according to this Word, I see chaos. But if I'm grounded in this word, if I'm grounded in truth, if I'm grounded in the truth about who God is, if I'm grounded in the truth about who God says I am, that I'm redeemed, that I'm free, that I'm loved, that I've been given grace and mercy, and those are all the things that God is, and those are all the things that God gives to me. When I personalize those things to myself, there's still chaos all around me, but I'm at the center of the storm where it's complete peace. I think a lot of the time we find ourselves a lot like Israel, wavering and hobbling between two opinions. The Bible says that you can only serve one. You can only love one master. You're going to love one and hate the other. And I would say at least in America, we have a hard time with this. Because we don't see God's power in our lives. We don't see it manifesting itself in our lives. We don't see the fire coming down from heaven and lighting the altar on fire, doused in water. We don't see real change because we're not totally committed. And I convict myself of this as much as I hope you're being convicted of this, that this whole total commitment thing is hard. That's why we find ourselves at the edge at the diving board. Sometimes God needs to step in and step on our hand so that we'll let go. We talked about last week of how we need to let go of these things and let God take control of our lives. And I don't think we see God's power because we don't totally trust in God. We don't totally trust in His truth. We don't totally believe the promises that He's given to us. And honestly, we look for the mundane. We look for the simple. We settle for beige. I know it's scary to jump. I know it's scary to jump off and let go. Heck, that's where I find me. But it's so necessary, you guys. How long are we going to continue serving two different masters, or trying to? How long until you actually give God your heart? Aren't you tired of the mundane, I'm not saying that when we commit to God and His power continues in our total commitment that there's not going to be mundane moments. Sometimes the plodding along is the journey. Sometimes taking those little steps is the journey. But guys, we can see the power of God even in those little steps if we just let go and let Him take control of our lives. If we can just totally commit to Him. totally committing to Him with with the things that we say, the things that we talk about, with the things that we talk about with the people around us, where our conversation goes, the things that we post on social media. How is that total commitment? Does your social media page represent the things that you hate? Or are you a true representation of Christ? Because all I see is people who are just upset and scared. But God doesn't want us to live in fear. God doesn't want us to live in that. What would it look like if we totally committed all of that over to Him? What would it look like if we totally committed our marriage over to God? Man, I'm done with my pride. I'm done with putting myself first. What if those are the things we said? What if we said, God, I want to be done putting everything that I want in charge? How much different would our marriage look, you guys? How much different would our finances look? If we just said, God, this isn't mine. I'm going to give it back to you anyway. And this is not some sort of ploy for you to give to Restoration Church. Although if you want to, I'm not going to stop you. But if you follow Jesus and you are not giving to a local church, if you're not giving to a local organization, if you're not blessing people, how are you totally committed? Tell me how you're totally committed. Seriously, in the comments or whatever on YouTube, tell me. Our lives look mundane because we want them to be that way. Because we're not being ruthless with sin. When we see God's power continue in total commitment, when we daily are doing that, man, we set the world on fire. That's when we see people following Jesus. That's when we see transparency with one another and with God. That's when we see community with one another and with Jesus. That's when we see real lives changed from Christ to us and through us to the world. We are so like Israel, though. That looks like a nice prophet over there. Maybe I'll go see what they got going on. Ooh, that's a nice little, that makes me feel good. I'm going to go check that out. Listen to Mullet Elijah. Jump off the board. Totally commit. God, I pray that we would totally commit to you. God, I pray right now that you would do a miraculous work in our lives and the people around us. God, I pray that you would do a miraculous work in me. God, help me to give up myself. God, help this church to live selflessly. God, would you please show your power? God, you say that your power lives in us. God, I pray that we would live that way. Help us to give it up and give it to you. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.